Welcome to Lead Today with me, Kalina. Let's talk leadership.
This episode would not be possible without Anchor. It's free and the easiest way to make a podcast. They're creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Welcome back to another episode of the Lead Today show. I'm excited to join you today because I don't have a live guest. But what I was thinking about is I've been reading this really powerful book, and I thought, if I'm not going to share about a live guest, I can still share about someone's work that I think is brilliant. And unfortunately, this person is no longer alive, so there was no chance to have an interview with him. But the good news is we can chat about his book. I think that books have such a powerful way, whether you're talking about fiction or nonfiction, they have first of all, in writing my book that's almost complete, this has been years of distilling this content, and I've heard both ends of the spectrum. Some people write a book in a couple days, in a couple hours. Other people, put their line in the sand and they really want perfection, and I've seen, the evolution of my book. And so when I think of people putting out a finished copy into the world, there's so much thought behind it. And so I love reading, and I have for a very long time. I started when I was like 4. I had actually set up a library system as a kid in my in my room. I would categorize all my books. I was a super nerd. So this is sort of near and dear to my heart. I don't necessarily want to do a book report, but I'd like to just discuss a bit of my thoughts and sort of some poignant sections that I think you might find useful in this landscape or the time that we're in at the moment. So the book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and he was a clinical psychologist born in Vienna in Austria, and he earned an MD and a PhD from the University of Vienna. He's published more than 30 books on theoretical and clinical psychology and served as a visiting professor and lecturer at Harvard, Stanford, and elsewhere. Frankl died in 1997. And what's interesting is that this book, the first part is autobiographical, so it's about his life and a very particular experience or series of experiences when he lived in Nazi death camps from 1942 to 1945. He labored in 4 different camps, including Auschwitz. And so he's really shared some very troubling, honestly, or kind of awakening. They woke me up for sure in reading them. Just honestly horrible. I don't know what other word to share or how to say it, but I think in that, what he means to say is that although in life we can't avoid suffering, we can choose what it means. And that's why, man's search for meaning is this idea that we all search for this bigger meaning and purpose in our lives, and none of us get out of it without some level of suffering, but it's this choice that we make in the meaning. And of course, it's decently convincing, considering what he went through, the fact that he could find meaning and purpose in a way to overcome such a challenging situation and environment of segregation, discrimination, torture. It's, even though it was in 1942 and it's many years later, reading some of these sections, it was as though I was watching, or even it felt like I was watching it in a movie, and it was so painful to consider the amount of separation from their own families, all of their worldly possessions, but also, I'll read you a couple parts, and if you're interested, of course you can go and get it. There are a bunch of versions. This is a newer one. And then part 2 of the book. So part 1 is autobiographical about his experiences in Auschwitz and other camps between 1942 and 1945. And then part 2 is about his theory that he came up with. And essentially, so it's called logotherapy. And it's his therapeutic doctrine, essentially. So from what he learned, he came up with his own theory. And so that's what they talk about in part 2, and it has to do with existential frustration and the meaning of life. And I would say it's sort of, I don't want to say clinical. He references back to his times in the camps in part 2, but I suppose he tries to put a meaning towards suffering and give a bit of a psychological, more professional take on his own experience and the theory that is related and the meaning of life. And it's I'm just kind of flipping through these pages. Every time any page I look to, there's something painful on, which is just on it, which is an interesting thing. But anyway, I guess if you're sitting there going, how is this relevant to you and what you're going through? As I said, I think there's any level of suffering, depending on what you're going through, and it might not be comparable to what Frankl went through in his experience. But I think this part, it's on page 44. I think this part explains it well. So, he writes, to draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. It also follows that a very trifling thing can cause the greatest of joys. And he continues with a story from Auschwitz. But I think that's interesting, right? Because it's true. We can find joy in the small things, and something seemingly small to someone can completely change our lives. And it's all, again, back to the meaning that we assign to an experience. And if we look at some psychologists that are more modern, so the holistic psychologist that's on Instagram, like, she talks about this in the context of trauma. So the idea that trauma really is only traumatic if our body and our mind, depending on what meaning our body and mind assign to it. So in my study of biocompass and Germanic New Medicine, there's interesting sort of theory that for something to be a traumatic moment or to cause, let's say, a triggering moment, it needs to be unexpected, dramatic, isolating, or for you to have no strategy on how to deal with it, or you perceive that you have no strategy. So if it's any one of those 4 things, it can be traumatizing. And again, we do get to choose the meaning we have for it, and our nervous systems are affected. So, if you get into a car accident, it's unexpected. Of course, that can be traumatizing. It's not that you decided to be traumatized, right? It's like on a very physical level, your body is reasonably, I guess, shaken from that event. So, there are different levels of trauma, but just that part, reading that part to say that suffering can take over our minds and our spirits. And I think that the size of the suffering is inconsequential, or is less important than, I suppose, our ability to handle it and our ability to take it on and overcome it. Because suffering in and of itself, we can take something very small and suffer, or we can have a very big, challenging experience and find more power and meaning from it and move from it in a powerful way. There's another part here that I mean, I wish I could just read you the whole book, but I suppose that'd be more like an audiobook and less like me doing a podcast. Here's another part that I think is really powerful when it comes to our ability to overcome. So here he's in the midst of talking about his experience of showing up at this camp. The first night in Auschwitz, we slept in beds which were constructed in tiers. On each tier slept 9 men directly on the boards. 2 blankets were shared by each 9 men. We could, of course, lie only on our sides, crowded and huddled against each other, which had some advantages because of the bitter cold. Though it was forbidden to take shoes up to the bunks, some people did use them secretly as pillows in spite of the fact that they were caked with mud. Otherwise, one's head had to rest on the crook of an almost dislocated arm, and yet sleep came and brought oblivion and relief from pain for a few hours. I'd like to mention a few similar surprises on how much we could endure. We were unable to clean our teeth, and yet in spite of that and a severe vitamin deficiency, we had healthier gums than ever before. We had to wear the same shirts for half a year until they had lost all appearance of being shirts. For days we were unable to wash, even partially because of frozen water pipes, and yet the sores and abrasions on hands which were dirty from work in the soil did not separate, that is, unless there was frostbite. Or, for instance, a light sleeper who used to be disturbed by the slightest noise in the next room now found himself lying pressed against a comrade who snored loudly a few inches from his ear, and yet slept quite soundly through the noise. If someone now asked of us the truth of Dostoevsky's statement that flatly defines man as a being who can get used to anything, we would reply, yes, a man can get used to anything, but do not ask us how. But our psychological investigations have not taken us that far yet. Neither had we prisoners reached that point. We are still in the first phase of our psychological reactions. So he goes on to talk about how they pretty much all thought of suicide as being an option at one point or another. The first phase, they were very curious also. There's another good section. I mean, there's just so much, but I think, so from that section, what I take from it at least is that a man can get used to anything, but don't ask us how. And so they're in these terrible conditions, right? And they're segregated, they're starved, they have to work for free, they're in terrible conditions, they have people regularly being taken away and just burned, right? If they're deemed unfit to work or no longer useful. And yet they're saying, hey, we're in these brutal conditions, and yet, I used to be a light sleeper, but now I can sleep through anything. I used to, want a comfy bed, now I sleep on my boots with 9 other men and no blankets, and I can take it. And I think it's, again, reinforcing the notion that humans are so resilient and put in the most challenging of places. We can absolutely survive. But something that I think is interesting in this book is there's a difference between who survived and who didn't that Frankl notes that I'm not sure he initially maybe sought out to, well, maybe he did, but to me I didn't initially think that this was going to be his finding as a clinical psychologist. Most clinicians are less on the spiritual side of things, but I think what I took from this book is actually that really spirituality is what helped people endure such trying times because they had hope and faith in something more. And the foreword of this book, which was written by Rabbi Kushner, I think encapsulates this idea well, that yes, man can be put through, people can be put through anything or many horrific things, and they will still come out the other side. But people that come out the other side and flourish or are able to regain what they once had and build even further, those people, it seems to be, need to see and find meaning and find purpose in life regardless of their circumstances, or maybe even in spite of them. And so the last sentence of the original version of this book, the rabbi points to in the foreword and says, This is Frankl's words, just to be clear. We have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he's also that being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. Another interesting thought. So, okay, humans can endure all kinds of tragedy and pain. And then we're saying that man is capable of atrocities, right? Man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. So, man is clearly capable of inflicting pain, misery, suffering on a fellow human. But at the same time, when we're in dire straits like that, we do look to the Lord, or we look to God, we look to the universe as a means of finding peace, a means of finding a way to find, perhaps meaning, but to me, it's peace, right? In the last moments of our lives, we're looking up and saying, God, please bring me peace in this moment. And we see it in big moments in our lives, whether we're religious or not. There's sort of these rites of passage and moments where we want to be in community, want to be seen by community and held in that ritual, whatever your religion or even non-spiritual affiliation, but we as humans congregate to these sort of peak moments. And I think it's interesting, many people will shy away from spirituality because of perhaps religion, organized religions, and what they think about institutions. But when we look at it on a deeper level, the question to me becomes, have you experienced maybe not a miracle, but feeling like this humbling moment that you're smaller than, everything in the world? It's like, for me, it's watching a sunset or being at the ocean, where I just get this sense of, looking at the night sky also, like when you just see all those stars and it's like you're just this little blip, right? Or being in the Swiss mountains, or even a rolling countryside in Canada, just so much land. It's completely vast and you're just this little person. I also feel that when I'm flying many times. So for me, in this search for meaning, remembering that I'm just this blip in the universe, in this, what's existing right now, but also the, millions and perhaps billions of years that came before me. I'm such a small moment in time. This podcast is such a small moment in time. And as humans, we have the capacity for both goodness and evil, and it's really a choice. And often when we, in our most challenging moments, I think we do look to God or spirit, God, just get me out of this one situation. God, please just heal my sick, dying mother. We do look to God, and we do look to faith for our most trying moments, when we're most scared, when we're most challenged, when we need hope. And I think believing in something bigger than ourselves and bigger than our own ability to control our fate, I think can be really useful. And that's not to say that we can relegate responsibility to a higher power, right? It's not like, oh, okay, so nothing I do matters and I'm just going to put it to God. Yeah, that's fine. I don't need to care about anything. No, that's not the case. The idea is that, and I always love this quotation, like the wisdom to know the difference. Knowing the difference between what's in our control and what we need to give to, the universe, or just put out of our minds, knowing that we can't control all pieces of the puzzle. And so I this book is fraught with references to, in my opinion, God. And I think that if you have interest in understanding the existential vacuum, which is this idea that we're sort of haunted, as Frankl says it, haunted by the experience of their inner emptiness, a void within themselves. They are caught in that situation which I have called the existential vacuum. So it's this idea that we're sort of lost within ourselves and empty within ourselves. And I think that's, this is written a decent amount of time ago, but I would say this is still sort of a problem. He even mentions Sunday neurosis, which is this idea of when you have nothing else to do on a Sunday, right? You're kind of like depressed with yourself when you're not just rushing around and being busy. A lot of us, I think, rely on busyness to fill the void, to make sure that we don't feel the pain. And if we are feeling the pain, then perhaps on the weekend we numb out so that whatever substance can take away that feeling of emptiness. And I think that that's what we do in life. We sort of, it's actually funny, this reminds me of a moment. There's an episode, I did an interview with Tammy Peterson, and I would highly recommend that episode if you want to look more into, I suppose, her work or her thoughts, and also this idea of inner wisdom. But she talks about how essentially in the womb we're very peaceful, and then we're born screaming, and we sort of fight with ourselves a little bit to find peace again until we die. We're sort of in this constant negotiating with ourselves to feel peaceful. And going back to the quotation I shared about the end of the book, where, walking into their death in a gas chamber, they're saying the Lord's Prayer. They're praying for peace. So, I think what I learned from this book is that we can find meaning in life even when we're in a seemingly hopeless situation, even when we're in a situation where we think or we know that we can't change the outcome. I think we can use that as fuel. And that doesn't mean that we need to be happy all the time. It doesn't mean that right after a tragedy or after some sort of failure or a loss, we just spring right back into action. That's definitely not it. But I think that if we can find meaning from things that don't necessarily go how we envisioned, or shocking situations, if we can find something, if we can create a meaning that's useful for us in moving forward, writing out the story in a way that helps us to process it, then I think that that's the best bet that we have. And it's interesting because Jordan Peterson's work, he has a whole course, I think, on essentially that, like writing out your life story in a coherent way so that you have a cohesive dialogue in your mind, and that you can share, but that you are clear on about your life, about, I did this, so then I did that, and this occurred, and so then that's what it meant to me, and therefore I went and did such and such, like whatever. My parents got divorced, and so that led me to become very independent and be flexible to move around. And then in my early 20s, I was able to travel around because I was used to being on the go, and I was very adaptable. And I grew up at my father's business, where then I was able to learn entrepreneurial skills. So then I started a business of my own, really creating a cohesive dialogue about your life so that there's meaning to it. Because otherwise it's a series of unfortunate events that have no cohesive dialogue. The more I think of it, that's probably why people write autobiographies, published or not. I think it's why people want to see themselves immortalized in a sense, because it makes their life have meaning. Whatever they sacrifice, their time, their energy, time away from their family, or perhaps even a dangerous profession at times, it allows them to feel that there was meaning in it. And maybe they get a statue in their honor, just to immortalize them further, which is obviously just a trinket. I'm talking about a deeper meaning from perhaps even a soul level or in your heart, but certainly, most certainly in your mind, where you feel that you have created a cohesive meaning for your life, that all of the pain and suffering that your story up until today has brought you, all of that pain and suffering that you've had wasn't for nothing. You didn't survive and move past those things to simply continue being the same, right? And so actually Joseph Campbell's work is also fascinating when it comes to this, because his hero's journey effectively says that we need to go through trials and tribulations in order to come out the other side on a new day as this hero, right? I mean, we start this lowly young person and we need to go through all of these trials and tribulations to become the hero. And we can go through multiple heroes' journeys, and we can have many different mentors along our different journeys, and once you conquer one thing, of course you need to conquer another. So that's life, I suppose, a never-ending unfolding of journeys and of mastery or competency. And the bedrock of that in our minds can be this dialogue or this story from, I went from here to there to there to there. When we can cohesively speak through that, especially the most challenging moments of our lives, the pain and suffering that we would write in the part 1 of our book, right? If you were going to write a book like Man's Search for Meaning, and the first part was autobiographical, right? What is your biggest suffering? And again, perhaps it's not on the level of Frankl's or any of the people in the Nazi death camps, but what is your most poignant point of suffering, and what did it bring out of you? What is your new day? And if you're in that suffering right now, knowing that it's for something, if you're in the biggest suffering of your life, knowing that it's bringing you to your new day means that it's worthwhile to keep going, right? Because if you decide that it's all over and you're going to die or you're going to fail, then, well, that's 100% chance you're going to at some juncture. But if you can bring a sense of hope, if you can bring a sense of faith and meaning to the experience and say, this is going to make me better because, this is meaningful because, this is bringing me to the other side because, and I'm going to stay alive for my wife, my husband, my parents, my kids, my friends, my significant other, my pet, whoever it is. But if you have a meaning, if you have a purpose, if you're alive for something, then my God, does it make life better, and it gives you more energy to do things, and it makes it about more than just you. Because if you feel alone, if you feel isolated, if you feel like no one cares and it's all about you, well, then that's a pretty damn miserable existence. And not only that, but it doesn't feel very meaningful, because nobody's going to care if you're gone. Who's going to care, right? But if it's, oh, you know what, there's meaning because of my, not just a broad community, I think it needs to be very specific, right? Because if we speak in generalizations, the motivation fades. But if you're staying alive for your kid, for your parents, for your friends, for your sister, for your dog, for your job, I mean, some people find huge meaning in their jobs. So figure out the things that you're here for. Why are you here? Why are you getting out of bed? What is it that makes life worth living? What's the meaning behind it? I think if we can ask that, and there's another part of the book where Frankl speaks to curiosity and how curiosity is a natural reaction to an uncertain or weird scenario. So if you find yourself in an uncertain or fearful or new scenario where it's the unknown and you don't necessarily know what's going to happen, which, let's face it, that's everyday life. We're in a bunch of uncertain scenarios every day. Then if that's the case, I would offer up that perhaps the solution is to bring curiosity to the table and ask yourself why. Why are you doing it? Right? Why are you in this situation? Why did you start the job you started? Why are you in the relationship you're in? I think asking why and becoming curious is a hugely beneficial and very simple question that you can ask yourself on repeat to get down to the root of the matter and the true meaning of the situation that you're in. And again, this is self-derived meaning, right? So everything that Frankl says in part 1 is not factual. It's the meaning that he has given and his own recounting of his experience in Auschwitz and other Nazi death camps. It is not a factual account, but that's not what your life is. Your life is not a factual account of anything. Your life is your perceived experience. So, in remembering that, I hope that you can find some meaning and some answers to the whys of why you're here, perhaps consolidate your story, and then go on to continue writing the next few years of your life in a very meaningful way, because we all face adversity. The past year or so in this landscape, we can see it as death with no end and no beginning, or we can see it as death to rebirth. And so if things are changing for you right now, if things are challenging for you right now, if there's suffering right now, as I say, find meaning in it, knowing that you are coming out of it with some new skills, stronger, wiser, maybe gentler. But you are coming out of the experience with something, having gained some wisdom, having gained something that you can utilize going forward, with the hope and faith that it was for something. The suffering and the pain, the discomfort was not for nothing. It brought you and is bringing you to something new, your new day, a brighter horizon, and a next step for you that's going to be filled with hopefully joy and meaning. So I hope you found this useful and that it brings you closer to meaning. And if you want the book, you can purchase it pretty much anywhere. It's a classic. And I really want to thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, please do by clicking the link below in the show notes. Every single person that has supported the show so far is what allows me to keep doing this ad-free, buying this wonderful Rode mic, and being able to continue sharing content and information that I love. So I hope you will support the show or just continue listening, because that's a huge support too. And I wish you an amazing rest of your day.